And so, I mean, with the new homes, we've got the sort of code for sustainable homes, which is setting a standard, if you like. But am I right in thinking there is no standard for sort of retrofit of existing buildings?
No, there is no standard. It's being worked on.
Right.
There's a government quango called the Zero Carbon Hub that they have spent the last year, I think, canvassing opinion from industry, from house builders, about what low carbon or zero carbon, what the definition of it should mean as much as anything else, and what the construction standards should be. And I've been to one of their things. Actually, to be fair, they've done a very good job. They clearly know their stuff and appear to be listening to industry. But it depends on who you talk to as to how we approach this. Myself, I'm a bit of an evangelist. I wouldn't be here if I wasn't. But there are others who think that, well, you know, we need to do this slowly. And it's open to debate as to which is the more sensible approach. The one thing we can't deny is that we get our, you know, energy security is an issue for the UK. Fuel poverty is an issue for the UK, particularly in the world in which I work. You know, 25% more or less people who live in social housing spend more than 10% of their income on heating their homes. You know, so this is a problem for them. So lowering their energy bills is fantastic. So yeah, there's a wide spectrum of things that need to be considered when approaching this topic, really.
Because you know, often people, when talk about carbon, you know, carbon emissions, they refer very much to the carbon emissions during the operation of a building, rather than the sort of embodied carbon, the carbon that's sort of sequestered into the build. What's your take on that then? I mean, in terms of, you know, when you're retrofitting or building new, where would your focus be in as a company?
I think when it comes to retrofitting, I think we have to focus predominantly on how much we can lower the carbon footprint of any given building. We are all told that by 2050, mixing my numbers up here, it was 60% CO2 reduction cuts. It's now expected to be 80%, which is staggering. I mean, I don't even realise how significant a change of lifestyle what sort of change of lifestyle that requires. And I certainly think a lot of the audience, perhaps watching this, don't quite understand quite what that means. I don't think anybody does really. But to take an existing terraced home and to reduce its CO2 emissions by 80%, short of switching absolutely everything off practically, with the exception of one light bulb in each room and one ring on the gas stove, you know, it is technologically it's a major challenge, I think the embodied energy question is important because there's no point sticking insulation in a house that saves a ton of CO2 a year if it took 12 tons to produce that insulation, because then, you know, that's clearly fatuous. But for the sake of simplicity, as for someone approaching it from the construction end, if you like, I can measure the carbon footprint of a building, or I know people who can measure the carbon footprint of the building, and I'd like to look at the sort of the output side of things and say to a housing association, we can take 40% of the CO2 emissions of your housing stock away by doing X, Y, and Z. We will reduce the fuel poverty of your residents by, you know, 80%, and we'll employ a lot of local long-term unemployed youths in that scheme, and basically, you know, what's not to like? Everybody wins in that situation. The embodied energy, it needs to be tackled, but not by the construction industry. I think the embodied energy needs to be, you know, we need to be given some guidance by the great and the good as to whether or not we take that into consideration. I hasten to add the Code for Sustainable Homes does take that into consideration. There are things called, you know, products that have global warming potential of more than a given sort of number of credits. You're not allowed to fit into a Code for Sustainable Homes building. So we're tackling it, but whether you look at the carbon footprint in the whole and say it's the CO2 footprint of the building and all the bricks and timber that went into it, or whether you separate out the two, I tend to go with the latter. Separate it out.
Because I think the Code for Sustainable Homes, that doesn't just look at carbon emissions, it looks at materials, it looks at water consumption, which is obviously another.
Surface water runoff, which of course is very topical at the moment, considering what's just happened in the Lake District, and actually appears to be happening every 2 or 3 years. Some unfortunate community basically gets swept off the face of the earth by biblical quantities of water just falling out of the sky onto saturated land, and flooding is an issue. You know, let's be real here. The Thames Barrier, I think, when it was first installed, only had to be lowered maybe once a month. It's now lowered every day. In 50, 60 years' time, large parts of London are likely to be underwater. That will focus people's minds on this entire issue about CO2 emissions.
And also, if we can't defend, if our buildings can't sort of withstand flooding, then the whole working towards resilient buildings, and this whole topic of resilience comes in, is mentioned quite a bit.
Yes.
How do we make our buildings, effectively survive floods, and how easy is it to retrofit them again in the future?
Absolutely.
Well, again, the Code for Sustainable Homes, one of the basic questions to ask is, where are you building your house? If it's on a floodplain, you don't get a lot of credits for that. In fact, you don't get negative points, but you don't get any points. And at the higher code levels, particularly Code 5 and Code 6, if you're building on a floodplain, you're not going to get the code.